Porsche Cup car is one of the most challenging yet rewarding cars in iRacing. If you struggle to tame it, you're definitely not alone. But today, I'll share with you my top 5 tips to find consistency and speed in this notoriously difficult car. Okay, so we are on board at Imola and I've just done a couple of laps to warm the tyres up a little bit. So what we're going to cover first is trail braking. So super important in this car. When you brake, the weight goes forwards and over the front axle, which gives you more grip at the front and more rotation. So when we brake, we want to be coming off the brake slowly as we come into the corner and into the apex, and that's going to give us more rotation. So you should see it on my brake trace. We're going to lift off the brakes slowly as we come in. This is a good corner to demonstrate. So on the brakes, lifting off slowly, get that rotation, and then on the power to try and continue that rotation through the corner. So we're running the brakes all the way through here to keep the rotation in the front. As soon as you lift off the brakes, the weight then transfers back and takes the weight off the front axle, which then causes understeer, which obviously we don't want. And it is definitely possible to do this too much. So if you apply too much brake pressure too late in the corner, the back end will come round. So I'll try and demonstrate that here. And that just locked up a bit. But yeah, with the rear, with the bias being so far rearward in this car, usually to try and get that rotation, it's very easy to apply a bit too much pressure in the corner.
Fastest lap of the session.
And then it causes the car to over-rotate. Like that. So you see the back end steps
You cut that corner and got a slow down penalty.
Brake pressure on the way in. So that's trail braking covered. So the next thing to cover is throttle. So the same as we can use the brake to turn the car, we can also use the throttle in the Porsche Cup car with no traction control. So obviously no traction control or ABS on this car. So as we discussed earlier, trail the brakes in, and then we can start to use the throttle to rotate the car from the exit, from the apex, sorry, and through the exit of the corner. But obviously it's very easy to give it too much and get snaps of oversteer like that. So you have to be gentle and progressive on your inputs with braking and throttle in this car to make it do what you want it to do. So let's try and demo here again. A bit too much throttle on the exit and the rear is going to go. So you have to try and be careful on your throttle input on the exit of the corners, because you're already getting the car rotating as much as you can by trailing the brakes, and then you continue the rotation with the throttle, but obviously don't overdo it. But you see, I can use the throttle there to turn the car a bit more if I want to. So finding the balance is the key really with trail braking and with the throttle application in this car. So on to point number 3, which is weight transfer, which is the combination of the two things that we talked about. So you can imagine like a tennis ball on the floor of the car that would roll around depending on what you did. So obviously if you braked, it would roll forward, and if you went on the power, it would roll back. So trying to keep that tennis ball kind of balanced to get the car to do what we want it to do. So for the turn-in, we want the weight over the front axle, which is our trail braking. And then when we want some rear traction and rotation on the exit, we're going to shift the weight back by using the power. So we're going to try and combine these two things through corners like this. So trail the brake into the apex, start to get on the power, and get that extra rotation on exit as well. Next corner the same, so we're running in on the brake the whole way, and then stop, get on the power to rotate out. Training the brakes in, a little bit of power over the curves just to keep the car settled, a bit wide on the exit. And then we'll run through the last two corners, which are also a good example of this. So we get a hold of the brakes initially, and then we start to let off a little bit so the car can turn. And then a bit of brake to get it to turn in there, and throttle on the exit. So yeah, using that weight transfer from front to back axle to help with the rotation through the corners.
That was your fastest lap of the session.
Now we're back in the pits here because we're going to talk about point number 4, which is tyre temperatures. So obviously when we come out the pits, we're going to be on cold tyres, and cold tyres in this car are brutal, to be honest. So it's going to be the same at the start of the race. You've got to get the car off the line, and then you've got to be relatively conservative for the first couple of laps because you're not going to have the same amount of grip as you normally would, like any race car really. But obviously in these cars it is more difficult because you don't have traction control or ABS to help you to deal with that lack of grip. So you can see there the amount of understeer we get compared to we were getting earlier. And again, and the rear's trying to go as well. So in these cars I usually find it takes about 2 laps, depending on the length of the track, but most circuits it's a couple of laps before you really feel like you've got the optimal amount of grip. So again, you see a bit more understeer, and oversteer. So to get the tyres to warm up, obviously, there we go. So they will warm up obviously when you drive at speed, but until that point, you need to be nice and smooth with your inputs, which can be very difficult on the first lap of a race, trying to avoid cars around and stuff, but it's all part of the game. And then you can start to feel the grip come to you after a couple of laps and start to attack a bit more. So it's also useful in qualifying. Obviously in official qualifying you only get 3 laps, so you have to just deal with it, which is a real skill, people managing to get the pace out of those tyres that still aren't really up to 10. But when you have open qualifying in leagues and stuff, you tend to find that a couple of warm-up laps and then a couple of flying laps tends to be the optimal strategy there to get the heat in the tyres that you need. So yeah, that's the tyre temps covered. Now, point number 5 is brake bias. So you hear a lot of people talking about brake bias in Porsche Cup, and basically the way the brake bias works is the further back you go with it, the more rotation you get, but the more unstable it makes the rear. So in contrast to that, if you were to go further forward, you'd get less rotation, so the rear would be more stable, but then you are more susceptible to front lockups because it's moving the brake power more to the front axle than the back. So I like to run as a baseline about -5 on the dash, which you can see here. And if I find maybe on tighter tracks I want to get a bit more rotation out of the car, I can go a bit further back on the brake bias, so that would be to a lower value, so like -5.25 for example is the next click. If I roll that on my wheel, so there you go, you can see that's gone backwards, and you can see it's got a back and forward arrow on the Porsche Cup as well, which is quite helpful. Does on quite a few cars. So now we're back to -5.5, so we'll get a bit more rotation under braking, but also you're then more susceptible to rear lockups. So you have to find the balance, because if you keep locking the rear tyres up too much under braking, for one you might lose the car, but also it's going to overheat your rear tyres, and then they're just going to be less grippy throughout the lap. So we'll roll it back forward to -5 where I had it before. And yeah, it's really handy to have something on your wheel to do this without having to go into the black box, because that's a bit of a faff when you're in the middle of a race and you're trying to adjust the balance of the car. So yeah, that's how the brake bias works in the Porsche Cup, and obviously with your trail braking and weight balance that you're trying to achieve in the earlier points, the brake balance can definitely have a part to play in that. Okay, so we're going to try and wrap up those 5 points in summary here on a half decent quali lap where I wasn't talking and driving at the same time. So we're looking at point number 1, trail braking. You can see the brake trace gradually coming off the brakes as I go into the apex, which helps keep the weight over the front of the car and helps it to rotate nicely. And we'll see again through here. So trailing the brakes to the apex like that. And then point number 2 was the throttle application. So we see on the exit here, gradual increase in throttle to keep the rear stable and get the amount of rotation that we want. And point number 3 was the weight transfer. So we can see trailing the brakes into the apex here and then gradually moving the weight backwards as we get on the throttle through the corner. And point number 4, we talked about tyre temperature, which is less relevant now that we have the tyres up to temp, but it is worth noting that if we get them too hot, well, we can have the same issues of no grip, so you can bear that in mind. And then point number 5, we talked about brake bias, which we've got set at -5 for this lap on the dash, so rearwards. And if we wanted more rotation out of the car under the brakes, we could go further rearwards. And if we wanted a more stable rear under braking, we could go further forwards. But just be careful to either extreme with the brake bias that you can cause lockups on either the front or rear axle. So that was a slightly better lap, demonstrating the 5 points we talked about. And I hope that that helps you guys that are struggling a little bit more maybe with the Porsche Cup car, and helps you to bring those lap times down and find a bit more consistency and pace with what I think is the most fun and rewarding car to race on the sim. So thank you very much everybody for watching. I hope you found this video useful, and if you did, then please do like and subscribe to the channel, and hopefully bring you some more content soon. Thank you very much for watching.